them in the Constitution and how they work out over time. So my name is Kerry Sautner. I'll be hosting you today, but I will also be helping moderate the chat and the questions. And we are here with our top scholar at the National Constitution Center, Jeffrey Rosen. So Jeff, do you want to say hi to everybody?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Constitutional Battle of the Branches discussion.
I know, it feels like we should have music or something.
Absolutely.
So great class today, Jeff. We're really excited about this. And what I love about this class is it begins before the Constitution and brings us all the way to modern conversations going on right now. So we have a 4-part series to get through in 30 minutes, and I think we can do it. So one, we're going to define some of these big ideas like separation of powers, like checks and balances, and then dive into the founding stories and even the pre-founding stories of where did these ideas come from and what's the foundation around it in our Constitution, and then jump to Andrew Jackson, always entertaining, always interesting stories, and the bank veto, and then a modern case where we can look at subpoenas and the rights and duties of Congress. So I think we can do it, Jeff. Are you ready to dive in?
I am ready.
Okay, so do you want to start with the definition of separation of powers? Where would you like to begin? Or defining what the branches are?
Well, we can certainly define what the branches are. And friends, I know that you can do that because that's the first thing that was in James Wilson's very first draft of the Constitution. At the National Constitution Center, we have the rarest, earliest draft, the first time any of the framers actually put pen to paper. And the first words of Wilson's original draft were not, "We the people of the United States." They were, "Resolved that the government of the United States ought to consist of a legislative, executive, and judicial branch." Creating the 3 branches was the biggest idea, and separating them was crucial. Why was it so important to separate power among the branches? Because of the idea that we the people are sovereign. And because we are sovereign, sovereign means we have the ultimate legal authority, no single branch of government can presume to speak in our name. That wasn't the case in Britain. In Britain, the king in parliament was sovereign. The king had the formal sovereign power, and represented by his ministers in parliament, he could do whatever he liked. Later on in Britain, the idea of parliamentary sovereignty evolved to the point where the prime minister, with a parliamentary majority, can do whatever he or she likes, essentially unchecked. Judicial review in Britain wasn't introduced until just last year, when you had the newly created Supreme Court in Britain for the first time checking Prime Minister Boris Johnson's attempt to prorogue or dissolve Parliament by invoking the royal prerogative. He was basically saying, I'm going to be able to channel the Queen. And the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. It took Britain thousands of years of its history and almost nearly 250 years of ours before it got to that point. Okay, so that's the big idea. We the people are sovereign. We have to parcel out power among the branches so no single branch can speak in our name. But why do we have to do that? Here I want to share with you a really important distinction the framers made that has as much to do with psychology as it has to do with politics. And it's the distinction between reason and passion. You hear it over and over again in the founding era. In Federalist 55, James Madison said, in all large assemblies of any number composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. The idea was that all of us are based and constituted with these unruly passions. Not all passions are unruly and unproductive, but some are: anger, jealousy, fear. We have an obligation to tame these passions with our powers of reason so that we can perfect ourselves and act in the public good. And that was, if you really want to read some of the Stoic and Epicurean philosophy, the Greek and Roman philosophers who the founders read. You'll see over and over again this idea that you can't just get angry and lose your temper. You have a responsibility to master your passions was crucial to what they viewed as the core of happiness. That's paralleled when they're creating a government in the creation of the separation of powers and checks and balances, because they think because human beings are if not wicked, at least have a tendency to be selfish unless we can master our powers of selfishness through reason. Therefore, when people get into government, they're likely to behave the same way. And therefore, you have to create political checks and balances at the constitutional level in the same way that each of us has to create psychological checks and balances at the individual level. It's because of a kind of cool-eyed vision of human nature and individual responsibility. So it's so fascinating. And all of a sudden, we understand that this is not just some dry constitutional theory that has to do with our elected representatives, but an idea of what it takes to create the perfect citizen in the perfect state, as Pericles put it so well. So that was why they separated power. And that's why Article 1 of the Constitution vests all legislative power in Congress, Article 2, all executive power in the president, and Article 3, all the judicial power in the Supreme Court. So separation of power is supposed to ensure that every branch will check and balance the other. But it's not absolute, because although powers are separated, the branches have some mixing of powers so that they can check each other. Both separation of powers into the three branches and checks and balances, the mixing of powers so one branch can check the other, are both designed to do the same thing, ensure the rule of reason rather than passion. But checks and balances is an example of how different branches share power. So Congress passes laws, the president can veto them. The Senate has a role in treaty making and judicial appointments. The president appoints nominees. We saw that with Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who was just sworn in yesterday. The president nominates, but the Senate can confirm or not. And the House can impeach, but the Senate convicts. So this example of checks and balances, or mixing of powers, came from Enlightenment political theory. It also goes back to the Greeks and Romans. So much does. And if you want, I'm just going to recommend all these great books to you. I have them here.
We're adding a homework reading list.
This is not
every class.
This is just for fun.
Yeah, well, I think we need to redefine the word homework as fun work. Yeah.
I'm reading. I read it for fun this morning, not to prepare for class, but because I wanted to learn more, because these are new books that have just come out. So here, I'll hold them up. This one, we're about to do a program on this at the Constitution Center in December. First Principles, What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country by Thomas Ricks. A really good discussion how the founders were influenced by the classics. Here's an amazing book. This scholar is going to be on that panel too. Carolyn,
can you hold it up closer? We can't see it.
The Mirror of Antiquity, American Women and the Classical Tradition. It's so exciting, friends, to see that women like Abigail Adams, Mercy Otis Warren, later on in Phyllis Wheatley, the first African-American poet, all studied the classics as well and were just as inspired as their male counterparts were by these ideas. And then there's a great series of books by a scholar called Carl Richard, and I just have it on Kindle. I literally didn't do this for prepare for class. I'm reading this for fun because it's really interesting.
Fun work.
Richard's book is The Founders and the Classics, and he talks about it too. So one thing you'll learn from reading books like this, and Richards, Winter, and Ricks will all be on our panel on December 2nd, is that the framers took from the Greeks and Romans and from Montesquieu, the 18th century political theorist, an idea of mixed government. Montesquieu talks about, he goes back to Aristotle, although everything does. Aristotle has an idea of three classes of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Those are the perfect forms. Monarchy is the king. Aristocracy, of course, it's the one, the few, and the many. The one, monarchy; the few, aristocracy; the many, democracy. Each of those forms of government, according to Aristotle, can degenerate or deteriorate into its debased form. So monarchy can degenerate into tyranny, aristocracy into oligarchy, and democracy into rule by the mob or demagoguery. I'll do that again because the words are so great, aren't they? They're Greek in origin, but it's also really important. The pure form, monarchy; the degenerate form, tyranny; the pure form, aristocracy; the degenerate form, oligarchy; the pure form, democracy; the degenerate form, demagoguery or rule by the mob. So in order to avoid all of these degenerate forms, Montesquieu recommended a mixed government where each class could check the other, could keep an eye on the other. The democracy could check the executive power of the monarchy, and the Senate represents the aristocracy, could check the excesses of the people. Now, it obviously wasn't a pure fit from Aristotle and Montesquieu to the US, because in the US, all people are created equal. We're not supposed to have different classes, aristocrats, kings, and the democracy. But the framers translated it by using that idea of Senate, representing the aristocracy, the House representing the people, and the executive representing the monarchical or royal power. So that is the gist of the idea of separation and checks and balances. We have some sense of its deep rooting in classical theory, and we have a sense that all of it was designed to ensure both the sovereignty of we the people, and by sovereignty, not only political sovereignty, but self-sovereignty, the rule of reason over passion.
So,
all right, Kerry, what do you think?
What I find, I just have to like point it out. I know you said it, but I'm going to reiterate it because it was such a good point. When we think of the Constitution, when we think of law, we think dry, flat, and legalese, that it is almost devoid of human, devoid of person. And with this, we're really saying, no, it was the exact opposite. Because of person being behind law, because of person being behind the government, we're adding in all these systems into play to counteract person or to balance person to person. So if one branch gets too aggressive or political or greedy, then the other branch has a way to manage them. And then the third branch pulls in. So at first, when I first learned about this years and years ago, it was always told that it was a tug of war. And then as we go through these classes, I really think differently about it. I think it's almost like a 3-point teeter-totter. And because that's so much more dangerous, like with no like seatbelts, and that you have to kind of perfectly always find the right balance so you don't have one side tip over or go the other way. So as we look at this, we know that this is the theory that the founders put into place. They take from these greats, they make it different. They take great ideas and they are creative and inventive and make it into something more. And then it goes into play really quickly with the Constitution and with Jackson. Do you want to walk through a little bit with Madison, or do you want to jump right to Andrew Jackson, who's always fun to talk about?
I think we should jump to, well, no, let's read the Federalist Papers, but we also have a great question from Karen Cantor. What's the best resource at the Constitution Center for learning about checks and balances? The best resource, as always, is the interactive Constitution. And Kerry, can I screen share it just because no class is complete unless I do?
Yes, but we will tell Karen this is what happens when she brings it up. And I will put it in the chat too. So you should have ability to screen share, but let me just make sure. Let me stop. That's what I need to do, is stop.
It's always so wonderful to bring it up. And here it is. And a good place to begin, I suppose, would just be to look at the powers given to each branch. So the legislative branch, Article 1, Section 1, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States. And then the place to start, Karen, is always the Joint Explainer written by our two scholars. Gosh, our scholars are so amazing. Every time I check this out, I hadn't checked out Article 1, Section 1 for a while. William Eskridge from Yale Law School is so great. And Naomi Rao is now a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, deciding some of the most important cases in America. And our two scholars, one liberal, one conservative, agreed about what the core of Article 1 powers are. And they include bicameralism, which means that you have two houses, limited and enumerated powers. Congress's powers are not unlimited. Although this talks about the expansion of congressional power in the McCulloch case, which, well, what the heck? Let's just talk about it because.
Oh yeah, let's go to McCulloch. It's a great example. We can
go back to James Madison, but
I think our students are so good with James Madison, and that I think it's really good to look at these court cases and watch how this theory goes into practice when we look at the battles of the branches.
It's true, and you know what, Karen, I have to say, I can give you my take on McCulloch, but the best place to start for any constitutional question I have is, are these joint explainers? Isn't it amazing that Bill Eskridge and Judge Rao, although one is considered very progressive and one very conservative, agreed on every word that we're about to read together. So it's like a unanimous Supreme Court opinion. You can be totally confident that every word, there's a line from Gilbert and Sullivan, which I love, every word of it is true. And that's what we can be confident of here. So let's just, rather than me riffing, let's read from the scripture and hear what Professor Eskridge and Judge Rao have to say about an early debate about the scope of congressional power. A significant early debate concerned whether Congress could create a Bank of the United States. Madison and Jefferson argued against the power, but Washington supported it, Alexander Hamilton's plan for the bank. Although the framers rejected bank incorporation as an enumerated power, the court upheld the constitutionality of the bank in McCulloch and Maryland. Here's the link, and we could read McCulloch and Maryland, and it's always good to read the primary sources. It is so important not to just end with the summary, but to go and read what Marshall said. But we're going to keep going because we have limited time. And then it tells us the New Deal court expanded on McCulloch's interpretation under the Commerce Clause, and in the 1930s and 40s, it got even broader. Okay, so I guess I oversold this discussion. It doesn't tell us that much about McCulloch, so let me just say a word more about it. I guess I will click the link. Okay, we get the OIA thing. And here are the facts. It's never bad to start with the OIA summary, which says that 1816 Congress chartered the bank. Maryland wants to tax the bank. McCulloch is the cashier. He won't pay the tax. The state appeals, says the bank is unconstitutional because the Constitution doesn't give a textual commitment for the federal government to charter a bank. Where's the power, says the state of Maryland. Point to the power. The question is, does Congress have the authority to establish the bank? And if so, did the Maryland law unconstitutionally interfere with congressional powers? And we'll just read the OIA is very basic, but it's perfectly reliable as well. The court unanimously says Congress did have the power to incorporate the bank. Maryland cannot tax. What's the power? It's the necessary and proper clause, Article 1, Section 8. And Chief Justice Marshall says that Congress possessed powers not explicitly outlined in the US Constitution, and he redefined necessary to mean appropriate and legitimate, covering all methods for furthering objectives covered by the enumerated power. And then Marshall went on to say famously, the power to tax is the power to destroy. And therefore, he said Maryland couldn't exercise this taxing power in a way that would destroy a bank that was legally chartered, and therefore the Maryland tax couldn't stand. So now I guess we really want to go to the necessary and proper clause, Article 1, Section 8. So let's do that and see what we get there. Powers of Congress, Article 1, Section 8. Who are our scholars? Randy Barnett and Heather Gergen. You just cannot do better than this, friends. I am just blown away every time I know this is kind of this may seem a little geeky if you don't know these guys, but Randy Barnett is the leading scholar in America arguing that the Supreme Court went too far in the 1940s in that Wickard and Filburn case when it said there are essentially no limits on Congress's power to regulate commerce because even growing wheat in your backyard might mean if a farmer is growing his own wheat, he'd buy less wheat at the store, and that could have some minor impact on interstate commerce for wheat in a tiny way, affecting the price of wheat or the market for wheat, and therefore that Congress could stop a farmer from growing wheat in his backyard. Randy Barnett argued that that case should be overruled in the Gonzalez and Raich case at the Supreme Court. He lost that case, so still the broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause reigns, but he's trying to push back. Heather Gergen is the dean of Yale Law School right now. She has argued in favor of the court's broad interpretation of congressional power. And so they have very different views of it. But we have this common statement, which is so wonderful because we know that every word in it is true, just like Gilbert and Sullivan. However, this is about federalism, so it's not going to tell us about the scope of the necessary and proper clause. But I think that you already have a pretty good idea of what the debate in McCulloch was and what the debate is today. Basically, the framers presumed enumerated powers. Chief Justice Marshall interprets congressional commerce power as well as the necessary and proper clause, which was known as the sweeping clause because it was so sweeping in its power. He interprets that to mean as long as the end is legitimate and the means are appropriate, then it doesn't have to be strictly necessary, but just convenient. And that gave Congress a whole lot of power, although not completely unlimited power. And the debate today is whether what's the check, what's the limit? Did Congress in subsequent cases go too far? All right, Kerry, how
Okay.
does all that
I
sound?
think that's great. I think it lays out what I think is one of the most important things that when we do this class of separation of powers that we follow on is check to see where the power is. Do they have a power or a duty to do that? Because when you see battles between the branches, I always start with, does that branch have the power and the duty to do that? And what is the power and the duty of the other branch to either check it or complement it? So two cases that we can look at in the next 9 minutes. We definitely want to look at the subpoena case, but do you want to do sick chickens? Just because I love that case.
Oh, you've got to do sick chickens. It sounds
Exactly.
so
Just because
appetizing.
literally the name of it alone will make you all vegetarians.
Law students know the case as the sick chicken case. It's called the SCHECHTER poultry case. It's from 1935. And the question was the constitutionality of a New Deal law passed by Franklin Roosevelt and a Democratic Congress. And it was a New Deal law called the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. And the Supreme Court strikes down this part of the National Industrial Recovery Act for exceeding Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce, and also for violating the separation of powers and reserving on the powers of the states under the 10th Amendment. The law included price and wage fixing mechanisms about the sale of whole chickens, including sick chickens. So that's why it's called the sick chicken case. And it also had maximum hour limitations and protections for the right to unionize. These are all questions that are being debated today. Vice President Biden has endorsed a federal minimum wage law. So it's the same kind of law that was at issue in this case. And the president, under the law, is given the power to create codes of fair competition, and the court strikes them down as an unconstitutional delegation of legislative power to the executive branch. That's also extremely relevant today because this question of the non-delegation doctrine is being debated on the Supreme Court. And in the Gundy case, I think it was last year, Justice Neil Gorsuch and the majority of the court argued for a resurrection of the non-delegation doctrine, which hasn't gotten a lot of traction since the 1930s. Justice A.L.A. Kagan, in her dissenting opinion, said this would mean the end of government as we know it, because so much of the regulations that are passed today are done by administrative agencies acting under broad delegations of power from Congress to the president. This sick chickens case is especially relevant today, too, because it provoked calls for court packing. President Roosevelt was so outraged by the fact that this conservative Supreme Court was striking down the cornerstones of his legislative agenda that he proposed to pack the court after he won the election of 1936 with a huge landslide. And his court packing plan would have allowed him, the president, to appoint a new justice for every justice over the age of 70 who refused to retire. And the transparent ruse given by President Roosevelt was that the justices were old and tired and needed help because they couldn't keep up with their work. Now, that was too much for Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes and Louis Brandeis, a hero of mine. And they made clear to Congress, we're not tired, we're not overworked, and we think this would threaten the neutrality of the court. And in the face of that opposition and opposition in the country as a whole, even Democrats in Congress refused to back the court packing plan, and it died. However, the threat of court packing seemed sufficiently strong that the court reversed course. And in the famous switch in time that saved 9, one of the justices, whose name was Justice Roberts, no relation to John Roberts, his name was Owen Roberts, switched his vote from striking down the New Deal and started to vote to uphold it. And ever since that switch, the court has not struck down any law as exceeding Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce for a long time, although it began to resurrect the commerce power in the 90s. And in the Obamacare case, 5 justices would have struck down the Obamacare mandate as exceeding Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce, but Chief Justice Roberts joined the liberal justices in upholding the mandate as a tax, and that Obamacare tax will be before the court again next month. Congress zeroed out the tax in other words, it reduced the penalty to zero. And the question is it now no longer a tax? If it isn't any more a tax, does the whole law have to fall, or can the unconstitutional provision be severed? I know I'm packing an awful lot into all that, but I'm
No,
getting a sense
no
of how
pun.
relevant. It's just couldn't, all of these cases are so relevant, and we need to study them in order to understand what's going on today in cases ranging from the challenge to the Obamacare case to proposed court packing.
I just thought it was funny that we were packing in all that into a court
Ha!
packing discussion.
Absolutely.
And Colin did
Stop,
ask about the zeroing of tax and is it still a tax? So Colin, I think you're going to have to wait for the courts to decide that one.
But Colin, read the briefs. Go to SCOTUS blog, and you can always find the briefs on both sides of that case. And I think we did a We the People podcast on the. We definitely did a Supreme Court term preview, and our great panelists talked about the Obamacare case. And I'll just give you their take, which is this was Adam Liptak and Marcia Coyle, two great legal journalists for the New York Times and for the National Constitution Center. Marcia writes for us, among other places. They expressed the conventional wisdom that despite the fear of Democrats in Justice Barrett's confirmation hearings, most scholars think the court is not going to strike down the entire law, even if they conclude that the tax as zeroed out is no longer a tax. Most people seem to expect the court to sever that provision or cut it out of the law as a whole. So the rest of the law can stand, but that provision, now inoperable because it has no practical effect, could be severed out, which would save the law as a whole. That's just what Coyle and Liptak said. But Colin, please read the briefs on both sides. And, for your own sake, and all of you should, I hope to do this as well, make up your own mind, see which side you find more persuasive, and tell yourself or your teacher or your diary or us which side do you think is more persuasive.
Now, there's so many puns in there about severing and chickens, but I'm going to let that go.
No. Good. Yeah.
And I want to move, wrap around the separation of powers and the power and the duty of each branch to check the other one. And I love this case. And I know that's a weird statement because this is, was a stressful case for a lot of people in the country. Watching our different branches kind of battle can make people feel stressed, but are they doing what they should be doing? And I love this case because of the way Roberts kind of spells out guidelines. So this is what we need to look at when we're looking at cases like this. This is the subpoena case, and it really looks at this question. So how much power does Congress have to investigate the president's private financial history? So we started with the question is, where does Congress get the power to do that? And why did they do that? And then tell us how the case kind of unfolded. Because what I love about this is the interesting interplay between the three branches, that two branches are at battle and the third branch is brought in, but also is a little bit like a parent and like, I'm going to set the rules and guidelines, but you guys work it out.
Well, that's actually a good metaphor for what the court's holding in this case was. It was a rather parental holding along those lines. And Kerry, I like the fact that you shared with our friends that one can feel stressed when you see these inter-branch conflicts, but I hope people won't feel stressed ultimately, because this is what the system was designed to do. That's the whole point of separation of powers and checks and balances. It's to ensure that, in the phrase that we didn't read from Madison this time, Federalist 51, ambition must counteract ambition. The idea is that each branch is going to be pushing for its own powers, and they're going to run headlong into the other branches that are defending their own prerogatives, and that will, in the end, protect liberty. So that's why conflict is good in this consequence, because it allows us to be governed by reason rather than passion. Okay, Trump and Mazar. The question is how much power Congress has to investigate the president's private finances and his tax returns. Congress does have a subpoena power. A subpoena is a legal instrument where Congress or a grand jury or a prosecutor can just ask for information. The ordinary standard for subpoenas in criminal cases is really not too high. The information has to be relevant to a legitimate criminal investigation, and a prosecutor can get it. And that's why huge amounts of data, cell phone, emails, all that can come in as long as it's arguably relevant to a legitimate investigation. But Congress has a slightly different standard because the court doesn't want it to be using its subpoena power to just fish for political wrongdoing. And that's why in a case called the McDoherty case from the Teapot Dome scandal, McGrain versus Doherty, 1927, the court says that Congress has the power to issue subpoenas for legislative purposes, but not for purely investigative purposes. In other words, they can look for information that might guide them as they decide what laws or legislation to pass, but they can't go on fishing expedition for crimes. So that was a distinction that the court in the Trump and Mazars case affirmed. But the difference here was that the court came up with a bunch of factors that judges should use it in balancing the interests of the two branches, Congress and the president. Under earlier case law, the Congress had to have the power to get needed information, and the power had to be indispensable to wise and effective legislation, but it also had to be related to a valid legislative purpose. And the standard that the court came up with here was that lower courts should carefully assess the legislative purpose given for the presidential record. Second, they should insist on a subpoena no broader than reasonably necessary to support Congress's legislative objectives. Third, Congress should treat more detailed and attentive evidence of a valid legislative purpose as better. And fourth, courts should assess the burdens placed on the president by the subpoenas as part of interbranch rivalries. I don't know if that sounded like gobbledygook because it was a lot of words. But if we went back and evaluated, I don't mean to say there was anything unclear about it. It just these multi-part tests can be difficult to grasp when you hear them the first time. But the gist of it is asking courts to look closely at what the stated legislative purpose is. So it helps, the court says, if Congress says in advance what it's looking for, at least what area it's investigating, rather than just we think this stuff might possibly be useful. And then they have to balance the burdens on the president against the Congress's need for the information, and the subpoena shouldn't be any broader than it has to be. And ultimately, they have to decide whether there's a valid legislative purpose. So that standard was judicious enough that progressive as well as conservative justices joined it. It was a 7-2 decision, and then it went back to the lower courts to assess whether the subpoenas are valid. The bottom line, Congress is not going to get those tax returns before the election. Different result in the case that arose from the Southern District of New York, where the court basically said the subpoena could go forward, but the president could still object that it was overbroad. He did object that it's overbroad, so that grand jury is not going to get those tax returns yet either. But the standard in the companion case, the Deutsche Bank case, was more deferential and less multifaceted than Trump and Mazars.
And in general, the president isn't allowed to use executive privilege to say, I can't deal with this right now for anything, but Congress can't just do, and I love the saying fishing expeditions. Nobody likes a broad warrant, a broad subpoena in this country. We like determined and clear things. So I think that's a really interesting way to wrap it up. But Jeff, as we kind of pull this all together, I think the biggest takeaway is the system was designed to work this way and to create these conflicts. So there's time to cool down, time to work through processes and try to get to the best outcome and get to the biggest win for we the people. Is that a clear way to kind of summarize separation of powers and checks and balances and how they are really there to make the system work better, even though at times it feels like it's working in conflict?
It is a great way to summarize separation of powers and checks and balances. And the greatest win for we the people is to allow us to be governed by reason rather than passion.
And that's the best takeaway of the day. So thank you so much, Jeff Rosen. Thank you, everybody in class. If there's any follow-up questions, you can make sure you share them with me. And before I forget, I want to share this one more time. That first link that you see in there, that is the link to Friday's class, because this Friday, we are going to be honored with James Madison joining us from Colonial Williamsburg. I'm super excited about this, and just happens to be the day before Halloween for those who celebrate and you need some costume ideas. It's like a double win, the Constitution and costumes, all my favorite things.
Absolutely. Look forward to seeing everyone on Friday. And happy Halloween.
Happy Constitution. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Have a great one, everyone. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Kerry. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.